Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention please, we'll get started. My name is David Ross. I'm the President of the Battle for Australia Association New South Wales, and I welcome you all here today to the oration. Before proceeding any further, I'd like to invite Uncle Harry Alley to do the acknowledgement of country, please.
Thank you, David, and a very good morning to everybody. May we acknowledge the site of where we are gathered today, which is sacred to its first peoples, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose ancestors nurtured it through time. For thousands of years, people have gathered in this place to share our stories, to celebrate our culture, and to remember our ancestors. These rituals make it a sacred site, a precious inheritance of land and ceremony. Indigenous Australians have been welcomed with dignity into service with our Defence Force. Together, we can all take pride in the courage of those that have served over time, and especially those that served at home, for their unflagging commitment. Today, we acknowledge that heritage. On this sacred land, we remember with gratitude their service, their sacrifices, and their legacies. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. I'd like to welcome you all today, and I know that the topic here is a draw card, and certainly our speaker is Professor Frank Bongiorno. Welcome today, Frank, and Frank will be introduced more comprehensively by Darren Mitchell, who is the Vice President of the Battle for Australia Association, who will also lead us into the topic. Moving on to the topic, I know arguing about 1942 really gets some historians going, and I'll be eagerly awaiting to hear Frank's approach to that. But I'd like to just reflect on a personal experience, if you like. I wasn't born in 1942, just if anyone's wondering. I was born after the war, so a typical boomer, if you like. But there are some impressions that are very firmly in my mind that relate to the year 1942. And it was through my grandparents primarily, and my parents, who hadn't met at that stage. But my paternal grandparents were in Melbourne, were living the year through one son serving with the RAF in Bomber Command in England, and the other son, my father, who was wandering around Singapore, having just been captured by the Japanese. But in their particular situation, they didn't know till later in the year whether he was alive or dead. And it's worth remembering that some people who died in 42, their families didn't know until the end of the war. My maternal grandparents were living in a workers' flat overlooking Kirribilli Wharf, in line of sight to HMAS Cuttable at Garden Island, with a daughter, my mother, on guard in the coastal artillery at Cape Banks protecting Botany Bay. They'd used to fire across the bows of ships that tried to come in when they shouldn't have. I had made a few comments to my mother when she was alive about her doing that. And my grandfather, backing up again in uniform after serving in World War I, but on the home front this time, feeling compelled to withdraw his 16-year-old son, my uncle, from being deployed as an infantryman on the Kokoda track. I don't know whether this was typical, but it certainly reflected a lot of the concerns that families would have had on the home front. And no matter what the historians say, and I'm not criticising you yet, There was a real fear, and I can only imagine what it would have been like, having children overseas, your children overseas, who you didn't know where they were, what they were doing, or even serving in Australia, likely to be sent overseas. So anyway, that's my bit of indulgence there, and one of the things that we need to stay current with in the battle for Australia and our memories is what happened on the home front. And I think that it's very clear that we try and also promote what's happened in that year on the battlefield in 1942, but on the home front there were some significant issues.
Good morning, everyone, and may I add my welcome to each of you that David's already shared on behalf of the Battle for Australia Association New South Wales branch. The association really took form soon after the Australia Remembers program of 1995. In that year, some of you might recall that there was a 50th anniversary of the end of World War II and great markings of that across Australia. One thing that came from it was a desire to somehow bring together a number of World War II occasions for commemoration into one. Now, whether that's a task that has been successfully achieved, I'll leave for you to think about, but certainly in the late 90s, Battle for Australia associations began in a number of states, and particularly here in New South Wales and Victoria. And the desire was so commented upon and remarked that eventually it became a national day of commemoration. It was gazetted in 2008. On the first Wednesday in September each year, the Battle for Australia is marked, and so it joins Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, the bombing of Darwin Day, which is shortly upon us later this week, and Merchant Navy Day as the 5 national days of commemoration. Again, perhaps some of those decisions are political, but in keeping with the solemn and important nature to our community and to our sense of identity of Anzac Day and even Remembrance Day, these other occasions that mark Second World War are also of importance in remembering our history and those who have served and fought for who we are today. So this year's ceremony will be on Wednesday the 7th of September, and you'll hear more about that. One thing though, David's predecessor, Doug Rosa, who was here with us in the front row, wanted to initiate was another occasion when we gave some substance to the discourse that occurs around what does the Battle for Australia mean. And so the idea that Doug, and then in conversation with the committee and asked me to lead, was the creation of this oration. So this is the 6th occasion on which we've been able to hold an oration, and we're tremendously pleased about how many still take the opportunity, like today, to participate in a discourse in remembering, reflecting on our history, being led by someone who's astute and wise and professional in the work of history and can help us then work through some of the issues of that time and also how we remember it today. But we've chosen the date for this oration as the date on which the Battle for Australia phrase was coined by Prime Minister John Curtin. In a war bonds rally on this day, in fact the 17th of February 1942, 80 years ago, Curtin addressed a crowd at the Cenotaph in Martin Place, again significant for the Battle for Australia Association that we hold our ceremony in September at the Cenotaph. He addressed a war bonds rally, having released a statement the previous night conveying to Australia that Singapore had fallen. That had occurred on the 15th of February. On the 16th of February, he communicated that officially to Australia, and the next morning he was fronting a war bonds rally at the Cenotaph, a place of remembrance, in order to encourage and plead with people to take up the fight that he saw ahead. And he termed it the Battle for Australia. Thus, the phrase has stuck with us. I just sort of paused to think as I was coming to today about Curtin's experience of being Prime Minister. We're coming to a federal election. Curtin didn't take office from a federal election. And I don't want to tread on your toes, Frank, here, but only to briefly say that he got the numbers in Parliament and so took office in October 1941, sometime after an election had been held. Soon after taking office, he was confronted with some fearless enemy attacks, fearful even. The HMAS Sydney 2 was sunk off the coast of Western Australia, Curtin's own home state. in November 1941. Shortly thereafter, Pearl Harbor occurred in early December 1941. So just to imagine back in that time and to Curtin, he's only been Prime Minister a few weeks and he's faced with such significant incursions upon Australia and is in leadership. And what does he do? These are the things that we try to take up in this oration. He did actually, in some words, say, "I may be looking down a vista of weary months and soul-shaking reverses, of grim struggles, of back-breaking work." He certainly knew what task was ahead of him, and the situation really called for nothing less. If the task was to preserve dignity and decency, it was that back-breaking work that was required. And in fact, he dies in office. So 4 years later, and just on the cusp of the war coming to an end, Curtin loses his life to illness and doesn't see the eventual armistice and conclusion of the Second World War. He's a significant Australian, one that we ought to remember. He was faced with an almost Herculean task from his first day in office to his very last in July 1945. And thus, today's annual oration in his honour. I'd like to welcome Professor Frank Bongiorno AM to deliver that for us. Frank is Professor of History at the Australian National University, where he's recently completed a term as the Head of History at that university. Frank is a prolific commentator and writer in the press. You may have been reading his pieces in the Sydney Morning Herald of late, on broadcast media as well, speaking to us about Australian history, about politics and about our culture. Frank has formerly taught at King's College London, at Griffith University and at the University of New England, in addition to the Australian National University where he's currently, and he's held research fellowships at Cambridge University and at Texas University. As I mentioned, Frank is widely published in popular and academic circles. Among his books are The 80s, the decade that transformed Australia, The Sex Lives of Australians, A History, A Little History of the Australian Labor Party, which he co-authored, and he's also co-edited two books, amongst many others, but some that might be worth mention today for you. The High Commissioners, Australia's Representatives in the United Kingdom, 1910 to 2010, and Labour and the Great War, the Australian Working Class and the Making of Anzac. For his work, Frank has been recognised by the Australian Government. He's been made a member of the Order of Australia in 2019 for his significant service to tertiary education in the field of history. Dr Bongiorno's expertise in the studies of labour, politics and the Australian Labor Party, Curtin's party, will bring exceptional insight into how we remember the challenges faced by Australians during the Second World War's Asia-Pacific conflicts. And I have found, just on a personal note, Frank to be a generous and wise scholar whose work I relied upon a great deal during my own research into Anzac Day. I think you were second or third on the bibliography list in terms of number of contributions to my work. So Frank, today we are very eager to hear your talk titled Arguing About 1942. Please welcome Professor Frank Bongiorno.
Well, thank you very much for that, Darren and David, and for the invitation today. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be out. Isn't it wonderful to be doing something in person? And as wonderful as Zoom is, it's not quite the same, is it? I begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose country we meet, and I acknowledge also all those Australians who've given their lives in defence of their country. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests. There are the times in history, I guess, as in our private lives, that take on an unusual intensity. I think that Darren's comments about, those months at the end of 1941-42 evoke that. And, perhaps the final months of 2019 and early 2020 were a bit like that for many of us. Bushfires and pandemic followed one another in quick succession, and many lives were turned upside down. The final months of 2001 seemed a little that way in this country as well as in others. And similarly, although I think on a much greater scale, the months between August 1941 and February 1942 must have felt like that to many Australians. 3 Prime Ministers in the space of a few weeks and a change of government. Pearl Harbor, dramatic public appeal to the United States by Prime Minister Curtin, the southward thrust of Japan, the fall of Singapore, the bombing of Darwin, and that's not all of it. Now, there was a time not that long ago when historians of Australia took for granted, I think, that all of this amounted to the shaping of modern Australia and a landmark in the making of a national identity or in Australian consciousness, in a much quoted contribution to the crisis edition of the magazine Meanjin, published in March 1942. The novelist Vance Palmer declared, "The next few months may decide not only whether we are to survive as a nation, but whether we deserve to survive. We have no monuments to speak of, no dreams in stone, no Guernicas, no sacred places. We could vanish and leave singularly few signs that for some generations there had lived a people who had made a homeland of this Australian earth." A homeland? To how many people was it primarily that? How many penetrated the soil with their love and imagination? Now, to a modern sensibility, it's perhaps the whiteness of these words that might be most striking. No achievements, no sacred places, no one who'd penetrated the soil with their love and imagination. But Palmer, of course, had, I think, white Australians, settler Australians, as we sometimes call them now, mainly in view. And he said, if Australia had no more character than could be seen on its surface, it would be annihilated as surely and swiftly as those colonial outposts white men built for their commercial profit in the East. But there is an Australia of the spirit, submerged and not very articulate, that is quite different from these bubbles of old world imperialism. Palmer thought Australia would survive, and I quote again, that we will come out of this struggle battered, stripped to the bone, but spiritually sounder than we went in, surer of our essential character, adults in a wider world than the one we have lived in hitherto. Now, was Palmer right? Many historians have thought so. Geoffrey Blainey, in The Tyranny of Distance in 1966, said Australia carried spectacles from Britain that were obsolete. The fall of Singapore and the Japanese advance corrected their short-sightedness. That's his phrase, short-sightedness. According to his teacher, Manning Clark, writing in the 1980s, in 1942, he was a schoolmaster at Geelong Grammar, the war unleashed forces that would turn Australian Britons into museum pieces or darling dodos of the second half of the 20th century. The war, Clark said, gave us a chance to free ourselves from the stigma of mediocrity and inferiority. Noel McLaughlin, another student of Clark, argued similarly that the possibility of a Japanese invasion gave, and I quote, the heftiest hoist ever to Australian consciousness. Now, I think these waters were muddied a bit in the early 1990s, mainly by the controversies that were stirred by Paul Keating. As a part of his Republican push, his quest for closer engagement with Asia, and coinciding with the 50th anniversary of Singapore's fall, Keating launched an extraordinary round of history wars, denying that he had, and I quote, some cultural cringe to a country which decided not to defend the Malayan Peninsula, not to worry about Singapore, and not to give us our troops back to keep ourselves free from Japanese domination. This idea of an Australian nationalism, sometimes betrayed but never quite able to flourish, an independence unable to take root because regularly thwarted by a British imperial overlord, received some rough handling from historians from the early years of this century, most of them based, like Keating himself, here in Sydney. Australian nationalism, argued the late Neville Meaney, was really British race patriotism until Britain turned decisively to Europe in the early 1960s with its first bid, unsuccessful of course, to enter the European Economic Community. What often looks like Australian nationalism, Meaney said, was really just a local provincialism. Reaction even to the shock of the fall of Singapore did not disclose any larger sense of cultural or national identity, because Australia had no cultural or national identity that was not just a species of British race patriotism. Meany reduces what Palmer thought of as Australia of the spirit to, and I'm quoting here from Meany, provincial distinctions comparable to those of Cornwall and Yorkshire. Now, what I'm going to say today will show that I disagree with Meany's argument. The rapid and dramatic shifts in power politics, and notably the collapse of the British Empire in Southeast Asia in the 1940s, laid the foundations for Australian independence. I choose my words carefully. Australia did not become independent in 1942. Most Australians probably continued to think of themselves as, in some sense, British in 1942. Not all of them with equal strength, but it was still a prevailing idea. But national independence rests on several pillars: constitutional, political, strategic, diplomatic, economic, social, cultural. Even a cursory reading of the cable traffic from 1942 between Canberra and London over the question of the diversion of troops reveals all too clearly that the world of 1914 to 18 had long passed. After the debacle of the Greek campaign in 1941, which had helped to destroy Bob Menzies' Prime Ministership, a newly installed Labor government well understood that it couldn't afford to be implicated in a similar shambles. By giving overriding priority to the defence of continental Australia itself, both in its public rhetoric and in its confidential dealings with Whitehall, Australian decision makers inevitably rejected key aspects of imperial thinking that in 1942 turned on the greater strategic significance of South Asia, that is of India and Burma, compared with Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. The Australian government, that is, was also rejecting the assurances of London and Washington that Australian interests would be looked after so long as China could withstand Japan. Now, whether they were right in strategic terms doesn't matter much from the point of view of what I'm saying today. Australia's politicians, bureaucrats and generals had now grasped the primary responsibility of the state to protect its people from coming under the rule of another state. The journalist Warren Denning told a Canadian diplomat in 1944 that despite verbal tributes to Britain from Curtin and others, and I quote here, Australia's basic relationship to the UK had undergone a radical change as a result of the failure of the British fleet to protect this country against the Japanese. The confidence has been shattered and will never be restored. My argument here is that he was right. Historians' downgrading of the significance of the fall of Singapore and of 1942 generally has obscured rather than helped our understanding of the profound shifts in Australian identity that have occurred in the 80 years since. Now, to make my case about Australian independence, I'll briefly examine four areas: politics, diplomacy, strategy, the economy, the experience of Indigenous people, and the realm of culture. So let me turn to each of those. We might just get to the end of the politics bit before our break. Now, it's often been said that John Curtin, the First World War anti-conscriptionist, was an unlikely warlord. The late John Hurst suggested that he was so afraid of being harmed at the hands of the enemy, so sensitive to the casualties that fighting demanded, that it actually undermined his ability to lead a nation at war. Yet Curtin also had convictions, qualities and skills that suited the times. The war called for levels of government control over the nation's life that were a more comfortable ideological fit for a nominally socialist party than for the United Australia Party, that of Lyons and Menzies, not of Clive Palmer, with its residual attachment to what was understood as liberalism in Australia. Curtin himself led a humble life. It was easy for him to present as an exemplar of the austerity that he was demanding of the public. The reformed drunk had the zeal of a convert when it came to the pleasures of the people. Even beer he would refuse to treat as an essential item. Now, Curtin did attract press criticism, but a clever press secretary, Don Rogers, helped ensure that the image of a hard-working and self-sacrificing man of the people and saviour of the nation would circulate widely and influentially. Initially, there was no change in the thrust of Australia's policy making, but within weeks of taking office, as Darren has mentioned, the Curtin government faced the most serious crisis of any kind in settler Australian history, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and entered the war on the side of the Axis powers. Now, most of Australia's forces were fighting a war in North Africa, and Syria and Europe. Only the 8th Division was closer to home. 2 brigades had been in Malaya during 1941. Curtin had been mollified by Churchill's decision, made against the British Prime Minister's better judgment, to send 2 first-class warships to Asia, but these, of course, lay at the bottom of the ocean, sunk by the Japanese Air Force. Now, it's easy in the circumstances to see why Churchill should have reacted so adversely when Curtin's New Year message, calling for greater Allied attention to the war in the Pacific, produced for a Melbourne afternoon newspaper, was wired sensationally around the world. Curtin had dramatically declared, you know the phrase, without any inhibitions of any kind, "I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." Now, it's these words, of course, above the rest of the article that would be long recalled, inflated and misrepresented by some commentators and in collective memory as the moment when Australia switched great and powerful friends, moving from a British orbit to an American one. There would be further offence, of course, taken in late January 1942 when a cable from Curtin, almost certainly drafted by his External Affairs Minister Herbert Vere-Everett, told Churchill that Australians would regard the evacuation of Singapore by Britain as an inexcusable betrayal. Now, in an influential popular understanding of 1942, the fall of Singapore itself would become the very betrayal that the cable had warned against, the moment when the British were said to have selfishly abandoned kith and kin and left them to the tender mercies of a ruthless Japanese foe. Now, while many Australians still, I think, possibly believe that Churchill opposed bringing Australian troops to the Pacific, he and Curtin, of course, had agreed that most of them should be returned to meet the Japanese threat. But before this could be accomplished, on the 15th of February, Singapore fell to the Japanese, with most of the 8th Division killed or captured, alongside their British and Indian comrades, and much of the remainder suffering a similar fate in places to Australia's north, in Timor and in Ambon. The Advisory War Council, without Curtin, who was in hospital, was meeting in this city and discussed these events on the 19th of February. Of course, with members of the government really dishing it out to one another, with Curtin in hospital, clashing over Churchill's desire to divert Australian troops to Burma. News that the Japanese had bombed Darwin, which of course you'll recall happened that morning, arrived during the meeting, with Cabinet Secretary Frederick Shedden recalling that, I love this phrase, that ministers ran around like a lot of startled chooks, called Paul Hasluck's recollection. But in the circumstances, alarm was surely understandable. I mean, Curtin's position, supported by his military advisers and maintained under fairly intense pressure from Churchill and Roosevelt, was that the bulk of the troops serving the Middle East should come home. Churchill, however, sought to divert the troops toward Burma without Australian assent. He relented in the face of Curtin's insistence, but was so infuriated that he's said to have privately exclaimed that Australians came of bad stock, a jibe about the settlers' convict origins. Now, those troops who were not diverted to Java, where they would be mainly killed or captured, would indeed arrive safely in Fremantle. Curtin had many an anxious moment as he contemplated the possibility that the transports bringing them home would be sunk. And indeed, he's walking around the grounds of the lodge in Canberra late at night, unable to sleep with worry, became integral to the Curtin legend of the humane leader and the man of conscience thrust into, the unfamiliar and uncomfortable uniform of war leadership, heroically living with the consequences of his own moral courage. I'm not saying he wasn't so wandering around, but it's a story that was told again and again. Now, victory seemed a distant prospect on St Patrick's Day, 1942, when General Douglas MacArthur arrived from the Philippines just ahead of the humiliating surrender of his men. It did, however, boost Australian morale. Curtin's critics have seen in his willingness to leave military matters to MacArthur a surrender of Australian autonomy. And certainly a case can be made that Curtin should have been more assertive, But the partnership gave Curtin a strong ally and the Pacific War a strong advocate in Washington. Meanwhile, Curtin was preoccupied with repairing relations with Britain after the unpleasantness of the disagreements around Singapore. We shouldn't make too much, I think, of the lingering effect of those differences, at least during the war. I mean, Australia had left the 9th Division to fight in North Africa. It had allowed some of the 7th to provide a garrison in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. And of course, as we've already heard today, members of the Air Force would continue fighting the bomber offensive over Europe. Now, while the disagreements between the two governments have been elevated in myth and memory into a complete break with empire, the reality, even in 1942, was rather different. Even Evatt, referred to Australians and British people as belonging to the same family. His phrase, the same family. Australia wanted and received Spitfires from Churchill, and its war production depended to some extent on the assistance of British industrial blueprints, something that's often forgotten, I think, when we talk about the industrialisation of Australia. Most Australians still regarded their nation as British, as I've suggested, and of course in November 1943, Curtin appointed the brother of King George VI, the Duke of Gloucester, as Governor-General after flirting with the idea of appointing James Scullin, the former Labor Prime Minister. Now, for all its ambition to be more of a master of its own house, the government was unable to gain much say in the conduct of the war or in shaping the post-war order. Major decisions, of course, were made at the meetings between the leaders of the great powers. Minnows such as Australia could be and were safely ignored by the big fish. But this mattered less to Australians than their growing sense of safety as American troops poured into their cities. American ships and planes increasingly commanded the Pacific, and of course their own troops had successes in the lands to the north of Australia particularly. By early 1943, the Americans had defeated the Japanese at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Meanwhile, Allied troops, including Australians, pushed Japanese forces back over the Owen Stanley Ranges and the beaches beyond Papua. The conscripts who served in Papua in 1942 contributed to a legend in which an unusually young and supposedly poorly trained force confronted a more numerous enemy and endured the horrors of Kokoda Track or Trail to save their country from a Japanese invasion. Now, that legend is often wide of the mark, although it's certainly not wide of the mark in suggesting the horror of warfare in Papua and that very difficult terrain, and also the heroism, of course, of so many of those servicemen. It contributed to a sense that in 1942 Australia had begun to stand on its own 2 feet, to defend itself, its own country, in the face of a challenge to its survival. Australia's imprint in the world increased dramatically during 1942, in contrast with Menzies in 1939, who'd announced, of course, that because Great Britain was at war, so was Australia. The Curtin government made separate declarations of war on Japan and other Axis powers in 1941 and 1942. Australia signed the Atlantic Charter in January 1942, effectively becoming, at that moment, a foundation member of the United Nations. In October of the same year, Australia finally legislated to adopt the Statute of Westminster, provoked to act, some argue, by a bizarre case involving both homosexuality and murder on the HMAS Australia. The death sentences passed on 2 sailors found guilty of a stabbing had exposed a continuing limitation of Australian sovereignty. It was all mainly symbolic, but the passage of the Statute of Westminster placed beyond doubt the legislative independence of the federal parliament. Australia also took significant steps in further developing its representation abroad when, in October 1941, it opened its first mission in China, and a year later when it initiated formal diplomatic relations with another of those great powers, the Soviet Union. The Curtin government used this occasion as the pretext for lifting a redundant ban on the Communist Party of Australia that had been imposed by the Menzies government back in 1940. In retrospect, 1942 was also of great importance to Robert Menzies and the Liberal Party, that he would play a large part in forming and, of course, later in leading. One of a series, his The Forgotten People broadcast of May 1942, would become a foundational statement of values for the Liberals. In its elevation of the middle class, the family and home, it articulated ideals that would form several pillars of politics and society in the post-war era. I wonder if we might break, because that's actually a break in the thing, and it is 11, so I suspect, yeah, great. Okay, yes, let me talk a little now. That's the end of what I want to say about the politics side of things, about the economy. You'll be pleased to hear that my treatment of these other matters is much more brief. The economy. So during the early months of 1942, the Curtin government drastically increased its control over Australian economic and social life. A new production executive oversaw a massive transfer of resources to war-related production. Ted Theodore, formerly a Labor politician but now a successful businessman, was appointed director of an Allied Works Council. Essington Lewis had aircraft production added to his existing responsibilities for munitions. John Curtin and Ben Chifley, relying on the defence power, achieved by government regulation a degree of control over the banks that had never been a serious prospect before, while also, of course, legislating to take complete control of income tax revenue for the duration of the war and a year afterwards. The High Court upheld this legislation in a landmark case in 1942, and of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, each year around July, the states would never resume levying income tax. In a few months, as John Edwards has suggested, the government had effectively created the monetary and fiscal framework for Australia's post-war social and economic policy. We still live with it today. Post-war reconstruction could potentially have been even more ambitious. The Curtin government also, in 1942, introduced legislation asking the states to transfer power over a wide range of activities for the war and for 5 years afterwards. Under the new powers initially proposed, the Parliament would be able to make any law that, in its declared opinion, would produce economic security and social justice. The plans also amounted to a de facto Bill of Rights. They sought to incorporate FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 freedoms of speech and worship, freedom from want and fear, into the Australian Constitution. The kinds of things you can slip under the door when there's an emergency on. While the government soon retreated from such far-reaching ambition, subsequent negotiations with the states stalled, and the government, of course, would unavailingly resort to a referendum in 1944, by which time, of course, it was too late. The sense of emergency had passed. Possibly, as the late Stuart McIntyre indicates, if the government had taken the matter to a popular vote in 1942 or early 1943, it could have passed and allowed a much more adventurous pursuit of post-war reconstruction, although whether it would have been a good thing, of course, depends on your political views. Fighting the Japanese rather than fighting for socialism, however, was Curtin's priority in 1942 and 1943, and he was a sufficient realist to understand that any suspicion that the government was threatening the future of capitalism could hamper its present war effort. Still, Chifley led a new department with responsibility for post-war reconstruction. It was formed in late 1942, surrounding himself with a young and talented coterie of public servants led by the economist H.C. Nugget Coombs as Director General, and Coombs and his colleagues began mapping out a post-war order. So this doesn't begin late in the war, it begins at this moment really in 42. The period following Japan's entry into the war also saw a truly remarkable period of industrialisation as Australia turned itself into a combination of arsenal and food bowl. I don't have time to explore this in detail today. It's very underappreciated, I have to say, in both collective memory and in the historiography, but I can evoke a little of the scale of the changes. They had foundations going back to the First World War, soon after which Australia adopted a policy which involved developing defence-related science and industry to increase the country's self-reliance. They'd never entirely relied on the Singapore strategy. It meant that by 1942 Australia was in a strong position to defend itself and to assist bigger and stronger allies, notably the United States. One historian, A.T. Ross, believes that Australia's advanced industrial capacity by 1942 saved 40 to 60,000 lives and helped to discourage a Japanese invasion. General MacArthur did not save Australia, he argues. It was saved by the deliberate development of secondary industry through the efforts and policies of industrialists and government. There were mistakes and failures along the way. Aircraft production could have been more effective, and the tank project failed. But the overall story is a remarkable one of industrial development under intense hothouse conditions. Australia was producing warplanes of great technical sophistication before it had produced a fully locally made motor car. The same at tank, of course, even though the project was abandoned. To take another example, the Owen gun was the product of local ingenuity as well as of Lysarts, a British producer of steel metal that set up in Australia with government assistance and protection at the end of the First World War. Capital expenditure by the Department of Munitions increased from a little over £2 million in 1939-40 to almost £25 million by 1942-43. The rapid development of capacity in South Australia also illustrates this wider point. The architect of the nation's wartime industrial effort was Essington Lewis, a native of the copper town of Burra, and he was sympathetic to his home state's claims to a share of war-fuelled industrialisation under the Liberal Country League Premier Tom Playford. Factories producing munitions sprang up in Adelaide's northwest, as well as in several towns. An explosives factory at Salisbury near Adelaide would become the basis for the post-war long-range weapons establishment and the Woomera rocket range, an Anglo-Australian joint venture. With the shipbuilding industry established at Whyalla, these developments laid the foundations for South Australia's defence industries. But more generally, wartime industrialisation was the basis of Australia's post-war, consumer-orientated industrial economy that would employ about 3 in 10 workers by the end of the 1950s. Third area, Indigenous people. Indigenous people too were involved in this broad collective effort. 1,000 or so, probably, had managed to negotiate their way around the barriers to enlistment in the First World War, but this time more like 3 to 4 times that number served in a branch of the armed and auxiliary forces. That was despite the continuation of formal prohibitions on the enlistment of Indigenous people in the army in the early part of the war. The Air Force was more liberal. In a country that had adopted and developed the link between citizenship and military service into a kind of concept of an Anzac citizen, Indigenous service readily became the basis for claims to citizenship rights. As the Japanese threat intensified during 1942, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were brought directly into the war effort in greater numbers. Some worked as labourers in the Civil Construction Corps, others joined special Aboriginal units set up for reconnaissance, coast watching, guerrilla warfare. Torres Strait Islanders were formed into an infantry battalion to support coastal artillery. Now, Edmund Barton, many, many years before, had spoken of a nation for a continent. But the federal Commonwealth that he helped create had made a very light imprint on much of Australia's north in its first 40 years. In a country that prided itself on its egalitarian democracy and living standards, Aboriginal workers of Northern Australia usually lacked voting rights, often received rations rather than wages, and were forced to endure the paternalism and sometimes the brutality of employers, police, missionaries and administrators. The Pacific War unsettled when it did not destroy these patterns. The withdrawal of white labour from many occupations opened new opportunities for Indigenous workers, many of whom received wages in cash for the first time. The federal government's vast investment in the defence of Northern Australia brought that region and its people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, more securely, more surely into the national economic mainstream. And many white Australians from the south, who might not otherwise have had dealings with Aboriginal people, encountered them during service in Northern Australia, a young Air Force navigator from Sydney named Gough Whitlam among them. In a country whose political system had seen fit to marginalise or exclude Indigenous people, it was becoming easier by 1945, at any rate, if not 1942, for many settler Australians to imagine Aboriginal people as fully fledged citizens. And finally, culture. Now, I can do no more than hint at the cultural dynamism that the war helped unleash. The major incidents are well known. There's the O'Malley affair, when a couple of young soldiers and poets in Melbourne, James Macaulay and Harold Stewart, invented a deceased poet, O'Malley, and his sister, Ethel, who sent the poems in, and a collection of modernist poems, which they then used to deceive the editor, the young, fiery editor of a literary magazine, Angry Penguins, Max Harris. Of course, they ultimately pranked themselves. They created a legend and verse that has lived on. But no one warned that the mind repeats in its ignorance the vision of others. I am still the black swan of trespass on alien waters. It's haunting. There is the William Dobell case, when that artist won the Archibald Prize for his portrait of fellow artist Joshua Smith, only then to face the accusation and a court challenge claiming that he'd really produced a caricature that should have been ineligible. You can look up the particular painting on the web if you've ever seen the painting itself. I don't think survived, but it's burnt, I think. But there are images of it. You can decide whether you think it was portrait or caricature. There are the Angry Penguin artists, Arthur Boyd, Albert Tucker, Sidney Nolan, Joy Hester, but also other artists of the period, Russell Drysdale, Noel Counihan. Taken together, I'd suggest, representing the most influential engagement with Australian landscape, the people and a notion, I guess, of a national soul since the Heidelberg School of the 1880s and 1890s. I mean, Nolan's Ned Kelly series became among the most internationally recognisable images of Australia, certainly in the visual arts, but perhaps more generally too. It's surprising to me when I was living in London how recognisable that is, certainly to many educated British. It's often, for that reason, chosen as the cover for Australian books on books on Australian history. There were the novelists such as Eleanor Dark producing the Timeless Land trilogy of early Australia, beginning in 1941 with its new sensibilities about relations between settlers and Aboriginal people. The rediscovery of the literature of the 1890s, of Henry Lawson, of Joseph Furphy. A lot of material, released in cheap editions that could be readily bought during the war, particularly by soldiers. John Curtin opened his famous article in the Melbourne Herald, The Appeal to America, with lines of verse from Bernard O'Dowd's poem, Dawnward, from 1903. The aged O'Dowd himself was working in wartime censorship. The Australian Communist Party, in the most nationalistic phase of its existence, was at the forefront of these efforts to reinvigorate a sense of Australia as having a distinctive national culture. It called its youth wing the Eureka Youth League. It sponsored a wide range of cultural activities, museum exhibits, painting and so on, literature. There was a folk revival that would live on into the 1950s, as well as an insurgent interest in Australian history that the British filmmaker Ealing Studios recognised with 1940s classics such as The Overlanders, made during the war, released I think shortly after it, and Eureka Stockade, always of course starring Chips Rafferty. Eureka Stockade was even enjoyed, Australian diplomatic documents reveal, by the leader of communist Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito. Manning Clark would teach the first freestanding university course in Australian history at the University of Melbourne in 1946. The beginning, of course, of his articulation of a distinctive vision of the Australian past that would find expression in his 6-volume History of Australia. So, to conclude, did all of this come out of 1942? No, of course not. There were precursors, there were outgrowths. But I think we can see those frantic months of early 1942 as the progenitor of much of what we now think of as marking Australian national life. Many Australians paid a high price, of course, for that accomplishment or achievement, if we want to see it in those terms. One consequence of the fall of Singapore was that thousands of Australians entered captivity. That, though, is another marker of the cultural significance of 1942. During the 1980s, the experiences of that group of men gained an ascendancy in the business of how Australians remembered the Second World War, perhaps even Australians at war in general. Their wartime suffering, their post-war legacy of trauma, became, in many ways, the quintessential Second World War experience. Indeed, in war memory more generally, it arguably even began to overshadow its major competitors, the Gallipoli landing, the Australian victories in France in 1918, and maybe even the Kokoda campaign. In this way too, 1942 has made us who we are. Thank you.
I found your presentation fascinating from the point of view of what 1942, what impact it had on Australia's future, and it gave a completely different complexion on it for me. When you think of the post-war reconstruction, I guess our absence of significant need post-war. I know there was some, and I remember my father getting back from being a prisoner of war, certainly valued his Scotch, which wasn't as easily come by in those days. But I sometimes think, I get a bit impatient these days for some of the intolerances that we still have. But yet, when I think about where we were prior to 1942, I should be more appreciative of what was achieved at that time. Albeit that there was no direct attack on Australia, no intent to invade, which is always an argument that we seem to have at times about whether there was a battle for Australia or not. So I found that very interesting, and I'm going to be doing a bit more homework on the Statute of Westminster, which I think is very interesting. Speech, worship, want and fear. Is that what we've been talking about a bit lately too? In these interesting times. It was interesting too that the direction that the 8th Division Association, which was formed, just about all the veterans joined this association after the war. From 1946 to 2017, there was no politician ever invited to attend the Fall of Singapore commemoration at the Cenotaph in Sydney. And yet the patron was always the Governor of New South Wales. So there was a sort of almost a contradiction there. I agree with you about noting that for some, the prisoner of war experience under the Japanese was a quintessential experience of World War II. And it took us a long time to deal with that. And in fact, it wasn't until about 2000, I think, where a cash settlement was provided to either veterans or the next of kin at $25,000. And it wasn't automatic, really, up until very late that they got a gold card. And of course, when they got back from war, they were told, don't talk about it, just get on with it, and get on with your life. Whereas we're much more sensitive to the requirements today. And I think we have come a long way in doing that. And I think most of us with our service interests would understand that that's the case, and we shudder to think how we treated them after the war. So I think that was an interesting reflection that you brought on, certainly for me. Sometimes it's hard to put together a universal feeling or position for a diverse group of entities in Australia. And I look at the 8th Division, and they were split about what 1942 meant with regard to Major General Gordon Bennett. Some were on his side for having left Singapore, one of whom was my father, who supported him, and yet his medical officer, Dr. Rolly Richards, who some of you might know, was very critical. Yet, after the war, when there was a Royal Commission, the 8th Division Association embarrassed the government sufficiently, the 8th Division Association, to cause the government to pay for his costs. So there are a number of contradictions, but I think your reflections really show that there are a lot of positive outcomes from 1942, albeit that it was a pretty terrible year. I'd like to thank you very much.
8 decades since Singapore fell, we're pleased Frank Bongiorno could tell of the dangers ahead and of Curtin, who said the phrase we all know so well. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. It's been tremendous today. Another magnificent contribution to our collecting of contributions on 1942. This is not only the fall of Singapore and the bombing of Darwin anniversary on the weekend, but also with our esteemed colleague here, we acknowledge that Timor was also invaded and fell 80 years ago this week. It was also the Banker Island massacre, and among those who were massacred, executed, in fact, at Banker Island were nurses. And so it's my privilege to call upon Major Eileen Henderson to bring our proceedings to a close with our tribute. Eileen is a member of the Battle for Australia Association Committee, but is also long-time national and state leadership roles in the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps Association, and also a long-time member of Mossman RSL sub-branch. So Eileen, we welcome you to recite the ode for us, for which I now ask you to stand, and there'll be a period of silence, and at that point our proceedings will have come to a close. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eileen.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.